Section 1 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 1, The Story of Tuan McCarroll. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Finian, the abbot of Moville, went southwards and eastwards in great haste. News had come to him in Donegal that there were yet people in his own province who believed in gods that he did not approve of. And the gods that we do not approve of are treated scurvily, even by saintly men. He was told of a powerful gentleman who observed neither Saint's Day nor Sunday. "A powerful person," said Finian. All that was the reply. "We shall try this person's power," said Finian. "He is reputed to be a wise and hearty man," said his informant. "We shall test his wisdom and his hardihood. He is," the gossip whispered, "he is a magician." "I will magician him," cried Finian angrily. "Where does that man live?" He was informed, and he proceeded to that direction without delay. In no great time, he came to the stronghold of the gentleman who followed ancient ways, and he demanded admittance in order that he might preach and prove the new God, and exorcise and terrify and banish even the memory of the old one. For to a God grown old, time is as ruthless as to a beggar man grown old. But the Ulster gentleman refused Finian admittance. He barricaded his house. He shuttered his windows, and in the gloom of indignation and protest, he continued the practices of 10,000 years, and would not hearken to Finian calling at the window, or to time knocking at his door. But of those adversaries it was the first he redoubted. Finian loomed on him as a portent and a terror, but he had no fear of time. Indeed, he was the foster brother of time, and so disdainful of the bitter god that he did not even disdain him. He leaped over the scythe, he dodged under it, and the sole occasions on which time laughs is when he chances on Tuan, the son of Carroll, the son of Muirdac Redneck. End of Chapter 1. Recording by John Brandon. Section 2 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 2. The Story of Tuan McCarroll. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Now Finian could not abide that any person should resist the gospel and himself, and he proceeded to force the stronghold by peaceful but powerful methods. He fasted on the gentleman, and he did so to such purpose that he was admitted to the house. For to an hospitable heart, the idea that a stranger may expire on your doorstep from sheer famine cannot be tolerated. The gentleman, however, did not give in without a struggle. He thought that when Finian had grown sufficiently hungry, he would lift the siege and take himself off to some place where he might get food. But he did not know Finian. The great abbot sat down on a spot just beyond the door, and composed himself to all that might follow from his action. He bent his gaze on the ground between his feet, and entered into a meditation from which he would only be released by admission or death. The first day passed quietly. Often the gentleman would send a servitor to spy if that deserter of the gods was still before his door, and each time the servant replied that he was still there. "He will be gone in the morning," said the hopeful master. On the morrow the state of siege continued, and through that day the servants were sent many times to observe through spy holes. "Go," he would say, "and find out if the worshipper of new gods has taken himself away." But the servants returned each time with the same information. "The new druid is still there," they said. All through that day no one could leave the stronghold, and the enforced seclusion wrought on the minds of the servants, while the cessation of all work banded them together in small groups that whispered and discussed and disputed. Then these groups would disperse to peep through the spy hole at the patient, immobile figure seated before the door, wrapped in a meditation that was timeless and unconcerned. They took fright at the spectacle, and once or twice a woman screamed hysterically and was bundled away with a companion's hand clapped on her mouth, so that the ear of their master should not be affronted. He has his own troubles, they said. It is a combat of the gods that is taking place. So much for the women. But the men also were uneasy. They prowled up and down, tramping from the spy hole to the kitchen, and from the kitchen to the turreted roof. And from the roof they would look down on the motionless figure below and speculate on many things, including the staunchness of man, the qualities of their master, and even the possibility that the new gods might be as powerful as the old. From these peepings and discussions, they would return languid and discouraged. "If," said one irritable guard, "if we buzzed a spear at the persistent stranger, or if one slung at him with a jagged pebble—" "What?" his master demanded wrathfully. "Is a spear to be thrown at an unarmed stranger? And from this house?" And he soundly cuffed the indelicate servant. "Be at peace, all of you," he said, "for hunger has a whip, and he will drive the stranger away in the night." The household retired to wretched beds. But for the master of the house there was no sleep. He marched his halls all night, going often to the spy hole to see if that shadow was still sitting in the shade, and pacing thence, tormented, preoccupied, refusing even the nose of his favorite dog as it pressed lovingly into his closed palm. On the morrow he gave in. The great door was swung wide, and two of his servants carried Finian into the house, for the saint could no longer walk or stand upright by reason of the hunger and exposure to which he had submitted. But his frame was tough as the unconquerable spirit that dwelt within it, and in no long time he was ready for whatever might come of dispute or anathema. Being quite re-established, he undertook the conversion of the master of the house, and the siege he laid against that notable intelligence was long spoken of among those who are interested in such things. He had beaten the disease of Mugain. He had beaten his own pupil, the great Columkill. He beat Tuon also, and just as the latter's door had opened to the persistent stranger, so his heart opened, and Finian marched there to do the will of God and his own will. End of Chapter 2. Section 3 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 3. The Story of Tuon McCarroll. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. One day they were talking together about the majesty of God and his love. Although Tuon had now received much instruction on this subject, he yet needed more, and he laid as close a siege on Finian as Finian had before that laid on him. But man works outwardly and inwardly. After rest he has energy. After energy he needs repose. So when we have given instruction for a time, we need instruction, and must receive it, or the spirit faints, and wisdom herself grows bitter. Therefore Finian said, "Tell me now about yourself, dear heart." But Tuon was avid of information about the true God. No, he said, "the past has nothing more of interest for me, and I do not wish anything to come between my soul and its instruction. Continue to teach me, dear friend and saintly father." "I will do that," Finian replied, "but I must first meditate deeply on you, and must know you well. Tell me your past, my beloved, for a man is his past, and is to be known by it. But Tuin pleaded, "Let the past be content with itself, for man needs forgetfulness as well as memory." "My son," said Finian, "all that has ever been done has been done for the glory of God, and to confess our good and evil deeds is part of instruction, for the soul must recall its acts and abide by them, or renounce them by confession and penitence. Tell me your genealogy first, and by what descent you occupied these lands and stronghold, and then I will examine your acts and your conscience." Tuin replied obediently, "I am known as Tuin, son of Carol, son of Murdak Redneck, and these are the hereditary lands of my father." The saint nodded. "I am not as well acquainted with Ulster genealogies as I should be, yet I know something of them. I am by blood a Leinster man," he continued. "Mine is a long pedigree," Tuin murmured. Finian received that information with respect and interest. "I also," he said, "have an honorable record." His host continued, "I am indeed Tuin, the son of Starn, the son of Sarah, who was brother to Partholon." "But," said Finian in bewilderment, "there is an error here, for you have recited two different genealogies." "Different genealogies, indeed," replied Tuin thoughtfully, "but they are my genealogies." "I do not understand this," Finian declared roundly. "I am now known as Tuin MacCarroll," the other replied, "but in the days of old I was known as Tuin MacStarn, MacSarah." "The brother of Partholon?" the saint gasped. "That is my pedigree," Tuin said. But Finian objected in bewilderment. "Partholon came to Ireland not long after the flood." "I came with him," said Tuin mildly. The saint pushed his chair back hastily and sat staring at his host. And as he stared, the blood grew chill in his veins, and his hair crept along his scalp and stood on end. End of Chapter 3. Section 4 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. But Finian was not one who remained long in bewilderment. He thought on the might of God, and he became that might, and was tranquil. He was one who loved God and Ireland, and to the person who could instruct him in these great themes he gave all the interest of his mind and the sympathy of his heart. "It is a wonder you tell me, my beloved," he said, "and now you must tell me more." "What must I tell you?" asked Tuin resignedly. "Tell me of the beginning of time in Ireland, and of the beginning of Partholon, the son of Noah's son." "I have almost forgotten him," said Tuin. "A greatly bearded, greatly shouldered man he was, a man of sweet deeds and sweet ways." "Continue, my love," said Finian. "He came to Ireland in a ship. 24 men and 24 women came with him. But before that time, no man had come to Ireland, and in the western parts of the world no human being lived or moved. As we drew on Ireland from the sea, the country seemed like an unending forest, far as the eye could reach, and in whatever direction there were trees, and from these there came the unceasing singing of birds. Over all that land the sun shone warm and beautiful, so that to our sea-weary eyes, our wind-tormented ears, it seemed as if we were driving on paradise. We landed and we heard the rumble of water going gloomily through the darkness of the forest. Following the water, we came to a glade where the sun shone and where the earth was warmed. And there Partholon rested with his 24 couples and made a city and a livelihood. There were fish in the rivers of Era. There were animals in her coverts. Wild and shy and monstrous creatures ranged in her plains and forests, creatures that one could see through and walk through. Long we lived in ease, and we saw new animals grow. The bear, the wolf, the badger, the deer, and the boar. Partholon's people increased until from 24 couples, there came 5,000 people who lived in amity and contentment, although they had no wits. They had no wits, Finian commented. They had no need of wits, Tuan said. I've heard that the firstborn were mindless, said Finian. Continue your story, my beloved. Then, sudden as a rising wind between one night and a morning, there came a sickness that bloated the stomach and purpled the skin. And on the 7th day, all of the race of Partholon were dead, save one man only. There always escapes one man, said Finian thoughtfully. And I am that man, his companion affirmed. Tuan shaded his brow with his hand, and he remembered backwards through incredible ages to the beginning of the world and the first days of Era. And Finian, with his blood again running chill and his scalp crawling uneasily, stared backwards with him. End of Chapter 4. Section 5 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 5. The Story of Tuan McCarroll. Tell on, my love, Finian murmured. I was alone, said Tuan. I was so alone that my own shadow frightened me. I was so alone that the sound of a bird in flight or the creaking of a dew-drenched bough whipped me to cover as a rabbit is scared to his burrow. The creatures of the forest scented me and knew I was alone. They stole with silken pad behind my back and snarled when I faced them. The long gray wolves with hanging tongues and staring eyes chased me to my cleft rock. There was no creature so weak but it might hunt me. There was no creature so timid but it might outface me. And so I lived for 2 tens of years and 2 years, until I knew all that a beast surmises and had forgotten all that a man had known. I could pad as gently as any. I could run as tirelessly. I could be invisible and patient as a wild cat crouching among leaves. I could smell danger in my sleep and leap at it with wakeful claws. I could bark and growl and clash with my teeth and tear with them. Tell on, my beloved, said Finian. You shall rest in God, dear heart. At the end of that time, said Tuan, Nemed, the son of Agnomen, came to Ireland with a fleet of 34 barks, and in each bark there were 30 couples of people. I have heard it, said Finian. My heart leaped for joy when I saw the great fleet rounding the land, and I followed them along scarped cliffs, leaping from rock to rock like a wild goat, while the ships tacked and swung seeking a harbor. Then I stooped to drink at a pool, and I saw myself in the chill water. I saw that I was hairy and tufty, and bristled as a savage boar, that I was lean as a stripped bush, that I was grayer than a badger, withered and wrinkled like an empty sack, naked as a fish, wretched as a starving crow in winter. And on my fingers and toes there were great curving claws, so that I looked like nothing that was known, like nothing that was animal or divine. And I sat by the pool, weeping my loneliness and wildness and my stern old age. And I could do no more than cry and lament between the earth and the sky, while the beasts that tracked me listened from behind the trees or crouched among bushes to stare at me from their drowsy covert. A storm arose, And when I looked again from my tall cliff, I saw that great fleet rolling as in a giant's hand. At times they were pitched against the sky and staggered aloft, spinning gustily there like wind-blown leaves. Then they were hurled from these dizzy tops to the flat moaning gulf, to the glassy, inky horror that swirled and whirled between 10 waves. At times a wave leaped howling under a ship, and with a buffet dashed it into air, and chased it upwards with thunder stroke on stroke, and followed again, close as a chasing wolf, trying with hammering on hammering to beat in the wide-wombed bottom and suck out the frightened lives through one black gape. A wave fell on a ship and sunk it down with a thrust, stern as though a whole sky had tumbled at it, and the bark did not cease to go down until it crashed and sank in the sand at the bottom of the sea. The night came, and with it 1,000 darknesses fell from the screeching sky. Not a round-eyed creature of the night might pierce an inch of that multiplied gloom. Not a creature dared creep or stand. For a great wind strode the world, lashing its league-long whips in cracks of thunder, and singing to itself, now in a world-wide yell, now in an ear-dizzying hum and buzz, or with a long snarl and whine it hovered over the world, searching for life to destroy. And at times, from the moaning and yelping darkness of the sea, there came a sound, thin drawn as from millions of miles away, distinct as though uttered in the ear like a whisper of confidence. And I knew that a drowning man was calling on his God as he thrashed and was battered into silence, and that a blue-lipped woman was calling on her man as her hair whipped round her brows, and she whirled about like a top. Around me the trees were dragged from earth with dying groans. They leaped into the air and flew like birds. Great waves whizzed from the sea, spinning across the cliffs and hurtling to the earth in monstrous clots of foam. The very rocks came trundling and sidling and grinding among the trees. And in that rage, and in that horror of blackness, I fell asleep, or I was beaten into slumber. End of Chapter 5. Section 6 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. There I dreamed, and I saw myself changing into a stag in dream. And I felt in dream the beating of a new heart within me, and in dream I arched my neck and braced my powerful limbs. I awoke from the dream, and I was that which I had dreamed. I stood a while stamping upon a rock, with my bristling head swung high, breathing through wide nostrils all the savor of the world. For I had come marvelously from decrepitude to strength. I had writhed from the bonds of age and was young again. I smelled the turf and knew for the first time how sweet that smelled. And like lightning, my moving nose sniffed all things to my heart and separated them into knowledge. Long I stood there, ringing my iron hoof on stone, and learning all things through my nose. Each breeze that came from the right hand or the left brought me a tale. A wind carried me the tang of wolf, and against that smell I stared and stamped. And on a wind there came the scent of my own kind, and at that I belled. Oh, loud and clear and sweet was the voice of the great stag. With what ease my lovely note went lilting. With what joy I heard the answering call. With what delight I bounded, 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 light as a bird's plume, powerful as a storm, untiring as the sea. Here now was ease in 10-yard springings, with a swinging head, with the rise and fall of a swallow, with the curve and flow and urge of an otter of the sea. What a tingle dwelt about my heart! What a thrill spun to the lofty points of my antlers! How the world was new! How the sun was new! How the wind caressed me! With unswerving forehead and steady eye, I met all that came. The old lone wolf leaped sideways, snarling, and slunk away. The lumbering bear swung his head of hesitations and thought again. He trotted his small red eye away with him to a nearby brake. The stags of my race fled from my rocky forehead, or were pushed back and back until their legs broke under them and I trampled them to death. I was the beloved, the well-known, the leader of the herds of Ireland. And at times I came back from my boundings about Era, for the strings of my heart were drawn to Ulster, and standing away my wide nose took the air, while I knew with joy, with terror, that men were blown on the wind. A proud head hung to the turf then, and the tears of memory rolled from a large bright eye. At times I drew near, delicately standing among thick leaves or crouched in long-grown grasses, and I stared and mourned as I looked on men. For Nemad and 4 couples had been saved from that fierce storm, and I saw them increase and multiply until 4,000 couples lived and laughed and were riotous in the sun. For the people of Nemad had small minds, but great activity. They were savage fighters and hunters. But one time I came, drawn by the intolerable anguish of memory, and all of these people were gone. The place that knew them was silent. In the land where they had moved, there was nothing of them but their bones that glinted in the sun. Old age came on me there. Among these bones weariness crept into my limbs. My head grew heavy, my eyes dim, my knees jerked and trembled, and there the wolves dared chase me. I went again to the cave that had been my home when I was an old man. One day I stole from the cave to snatch a mouthful of grass, for I was closely besieged by wolves. They made their rush, and I barely escaped from them. They sat beyond the cave, staring at me. I knew their tongue. I knew all that they said to each other, and all that they said to me. But there was yet a thud left in my forehead, a deadly trample in my hoof. They did not dare come into the cave. Tomorrow, they said, we will tear out your throat and gnaw on your living haunch. End of Chapter 6. Section 7 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Then my soul rose to the height of doom, and I intended all that might happen to me, and agreed to it. Tomorrow, I said, I will go out among ye, and I will die. And at that the wolves howled joyfully, hungrily, impatiently. I slept, and I saw myself changing into a boar in dream. And I felt in dream the beating of a new heart within me. And in dream I stretched my powerful neck and braced my eager limbs. I awoke from my dream, and I was that which I had dreamed. The night wore away, the darkness lifted, the day came, And from without the cave the wolves called to me, "Come out, O skinny stag, come out and die." And I, with joyful heart, thrust a black bristle through the hole of the cave. And when they saw that wriggling snout, those curving tusks, that red fierce eye, the wolves fled, yelping, tumbling over each other, frantic with terror, and I behind them, a wildcat for leaping, a giant for strength, a devil for ferocity, a madness and gladness of lusty, unsparing life, a killer, a champion, a boar who could not be defied. I took the lordship of the boars of Ireland. Wherever I looked among my tribes, I saw love and obedience. Whenever I appeared among the strangers, they fled away, and the wolves feared me then, and the great grim bear went bounding on heavy paws. I charged him at the head of my troop, and rolled him over and over. But it is not easy to kill the bear, so deeply is his life packed under that stinking pelt. He picked himself up and ran, and was knocked down and ran again, blindly butting into trees and stones. Not a claw did the big bear flash, not a tooth did he show, as he ran whimpering like a baby, or as he stood with my nose rammed against his mouth, snarling up into his nostrils. I challenged all that moved, all creatures but one, for men had again come to Ireland. Semyon the son of Stariath with his people, from whom the men of Domnan and the Fir Bolg and the Gallioin are descended. These I did not chase, and when they chased me, I fled. Often I would go, drawn by my memoried heart, to look at them as they moved among their fields, and I spoke to my mind in bitterness. When the people of Partholon were gathered in council, my voice was heard. It was sweet to all who heard it, and the words I spoke were wise. The eyes of women brightened and softened when they looked at me. They loved to hear him when he sang, who now wanders in the forest with a tusky herd. End of Chapter 7. Section 8 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 8. The Story of Tuan Macarel. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 8. Old age again overtook me. Weariness stole into my limbs, and anguish dozed into my mind. I went to my Ulster cave and dreamed my dream, and I changed into a hawk. I left the ground. The sweet air was my kingdom, and my bright eye stared on 100 miles. I soared. I swooped. I hung motionless as a living stone over the abyss. I lived in joy and slept in peace and had my fill of the sweetness of life. During that time, Beothach, the son of Yarbanel the prophet, came to Ireland with his people, and there was a great battle between his men and the children of Semyon. Long I hung over that combat, seeing every spear that hurtled, every stone that whizzed from a sling, every sword that flashed up and down, and the endless glittering of the shields. And at the end I saw that the victory was with Yarbanel. And from his people the Tuatha Dé and the Andi came, although their origin is forgotten, and learned people, because of their excellent wisdom and intelligence, say that they came from heaven. These are the people of Fairy. All these are the gods. For long, long years I was a hawk. I knew every hill and stream, every field and glen of Ireland. I knew the shape of cliffs and coasts, and how all places looked under the sun or moon. and I was still a hawk when the sons of Mill drove the Tuatha Danann under the ground and held Ireland against arms or wizardry. And this was the coming of men and the beginning of genealogies. Then I grew old, and in my Ulster cave, close to the sea, I dreamed my dream, and in it I became a salmon. The great tides of ocean rose over me and my dream, so that I drowned in the sea and did not die, for I awoke in deep waters, and I was that which I dreamed. I had been a man, a stag, a boar, a bird, and now I was a fish. In all my changes I had joy and fullness of life. But in the water, joy lay deeper. Life pulsed deeper. For on land or air there is always something excessive and hindering, as arms that swing at the sides of a man, and which the mind must remember. The stag has legs to be tucked away for sleep, and untucked for movement, and the bird has wings that must be folded, and pecked and cared for. But the fish has but one piece, from his nose to his tail. He is complete, single, and unencumbered. He turns in one turn and goes up and down and round in one sole movement. How I flew through the soft element, how I joyed in the country where there is no harshness, in the element which upholds and gives way, which caresses and lets go, and will not let you fall. For man may stumble in a furrow, the stag tumble from a cliff, the hawk wing-weary and beaten, with darkness around him, and the storm behind, may dash his brains against a tree. But the home of the salmon is his delight, and the sea guards all her creatures. End of Chapter 8. Section 9 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Story of Tuan MacCarroll. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. I became the king of the salmon, and with my multitudes I ranged on the tides of the world. Green and purple distances were under me, green and gold the sunlit regions above. In these latitudes I moved through a world of amber, myself amber and gold. In those others, in a sparkle of lucent blue, I curved, lit like a living jewel. And in these again, through dusks of ebony, all mazed with silver, I shot and shone, the wonder of the sea. I saw the monsters of the uttermost ocean go heaving by, and the long live brutes that are toothed to their tails, and below where gloom dipped down on gloom, vast, livid tangles that coiled and uncoiled, and lapsed down steeps and hells of the sea, where even the salmon could not go. I knew the sea. I knew the secret caves where ocean roars to ocean, the floods that are icy cold, from which the nose of a salmon leaps back as at a sting, and the warm streams in which we rocked and dozed, and were carried forward without motion. I swam on the outermost rim of the great world where nothing was but the sea and the sky and the salmon, where even the wind was silent, and the water was clear as clean gray rock. And then far away in the sea I remembered Ulster, and there came on me an instant uncontrollable anguish to be there. I turned, and through days and nights I swam tirelessly, jubilantly, with terror wakening in me too, and a whisper through my being that I must reach Ireland or die. I fought my way to Ulster from the sea. Ah, how that end of the journey was hard. A sickness was racking in every one of my bones, a languor and weariness creeping through my every fiber and muscle. The waves held me back and held me back. The soft waters seemed to have grown hard, and it was as though I was urging through a rock as I strained towards Ulster from the sea. So tired I was, I could have loosened my frame and been swept away. I could have slept and been drifted and wafted away, swinging on gray-green billows that had turned from the land and were heaving and mounting and surging to the far blue water. Only the unconquerable heart of the salmon could brave that end of toil. The sound of the rivers of Ireland racing down to the sea came to me in the last numb effort. The love of Ireland bore me up. The gods of the rivers trod on me in the white-curled breakers, so that I left the sea at long, long last, and I lay in sweet water in the curve of a crannied rock, exhausted, 3 parts dead, triumphant. End of Chapter 9, Section 10 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Delight and strength came to me again, and now I explored all the inland ways, the great lakes of Ireland and her swift brown rivers. What a joy to lie under an inch of water basking in the sun, or beneath a shady ledge to watch the small creatures that speed like lightning on the rippling top. I saw the dragonflies flash and dart and turn with a poise, with a speed that no other winged thing knows. I saw the hawk hover and stare and swoop. He fell like a falling stone, but he could not catch the king of the salmon. I saw the cold-eyed cat stretching along a bough level with the water, eager to hook and lift the creatures of the river. And I saw men. They saw me also. They came to know me and look for me. They lay in wait at the waterfalls up which I leaped like a silver flash. They held out nets for me. They hid traps under leaves. They made cords of the color of water, of the color of weeds. But this salmon had a nose that knew how a weed felt, and how a string. They drifted meat on a sightless string. But I knew of the hook. They thrust spears at me, and threw lances which they drew back again with a cord. Many a wound I got from men, many a sorrowful scar. Every beast pursued me in the waters, along the banks. The barking black-skinned otter came after me in lust and gust and swirl. The wildcat fished for me. The hawk and the steep-winged spear-beaked birds dived down on me, and men crept on me with nets the width of a river, so that I got no rest. My life became a ceaseless scurry and wound and escape, a burden and anguish of watchfulness. And then I was caught. End of Chapter 10. Section 11 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. Chapter 11. The fisherman of Carroll, the king of Ulster, took me in his net. Ah, that was a happy man when he saw me. He shouted for joy when he saw the great salmon in his net. I was still in the water as he hauled delicately. I was still in the water as he pulled me to the bank. My nose touched air and spun from it as from fire, and I dived with all my might against the bottom of the net, holding yet to the water, loving it, mad with terror that I must quit that loveliness. But the net held, and I came up. "Be quiet, king of the river," said the fisherman. "Give in to doom," said he. I was in air, and it was as though I were in fire. The air pressed on me like a fiery mountain. It beat on my scales and scorched them. It rushed down my throat and scalded me. It weighed on me and squeezed me so that my eyes felt as though they must burst from my head as though it would leap from my body, and my body as though it would swell and expand and fly in 1,000 pieces. The light blinded me. The heat tormented me. The dry air made me shrivel and gasp. And as he lay on the grass, the great salmon whirled his desperate nose once more to the river and leaped, 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 even under the mountain of air. He could leap upwards, but not forwards, and yet he leaped. For in each rise, he could see the twinkling waves, the rippling and curling waters. "Be at ease, O king," said the fisherman. "Be at rest, my beloved. Let go the stream. Let the oozy marge be forgotten, and the sandy bed where the shades dance, all in green and gloom, and the brown flood sings along." And as he carried me to the palace, he sang a song of the river, and a song of doom, and a song in praise of the King of the waters. When the king's wife saw me, she desired me. I was put over a fire and roasted, and she ate me. And when time passed, she gave birth to me, and I was her son, and the son of Carol the king. I remember warmth and darkness and movement and unseen sounds. All that happened I remember, from the time I was on the gridiron until the time I was born. I forget nothing of these things. "And now," said Finian, "you will be born again, for I shall baptize you into the family of the living God." So far, the story of Tuan, the son of Carol. No man knows if he died in those distant ages, when Finian was abbot of Moville, or if he still keeps his fort in Ulster, watching all things and remembering them for the glory of God and the honor of Ireland. End of chapter 11. Recording by John Brandon. End of the story of Tuan MacCarroll.
Section 12 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn. Introduction. The Boyhood of Fionn. He was a king, a seer, and a poet. He was a lord with a manifold and great train. He was our magician, our knowledgeable one, our soothsayer. All that he did was sweet with him, and however ye deem my testimony of Fionn excessive, and although ye hold my praising overstrained, nevertheless, and by the king that is above me, he was 3 times better than all I say. Saint Patrick. End of introduction. Section 13 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn. Chapter 1. Fionn got his first training among women. There is no wonder in that, for it is the pup's mother teaches it to fight, and women know that fighting is a necessary art, although men pretend there are others that are better. These were their women Druids, Baumaun and Leah Lachra. It will be wondered why his own mother did not train him in the first natural savageries of existence, but she could not do it. She could not keep him with her for dread of the clan Morna. The sons of Morna had been fighting and intriguing for a long time to oust her husband, Wael, from the captaincy of the Fianna of Ireland, and they had ousted him at last by killing him. It was the only way they could get rid of such a man, but it was not an easy way, for what Fionn's father did not know in arms could not be taught to him even by Mona. Still, the hound that can wait will catch a hare at last, and even Manannan's sleeps. Fionn's mother was beautiful, long-haired Muirni, so she is always referred to. She was the daughter of Teigi, the son of Nuada from Fairy, and her mother was Ethlin, that is, her brother was Luke of the Long Hand himself, and with a god, and such a god, for brother we may marvel that she could have been in dread of Mona or his sons, or of anyone. But women have strange loves, strange fears, and these are so bound up with one another that the thing which is presented to us is not often the thing that is to be seen. However it may be, when Ual died, Muirni got married again to the king of Kerry. She gave the child to Beaumal and Lealachra to rear, and we may be sure that she gave injunctions with him, and many of them. The youngster was brought to the woods of Sleeve Bloom and was nursed there in secret. It is likely the women were fond of him, for other than Fionn there was no life about them. He would be their life, and their eyes may have seemed as twin benedictions resting on the small fair head. He was fair-haired, and it was for his fairness that he was afterwards called Fionn. But at this period he was known as Damni. They saw the food they put into his little frame reproduce itself lengthways and sideways in tough inches, and in springs and energies that crawled at first and then toddled and then ran. He had birds for playmates, but all the creatures that live in a wood must have been his comrades. There would have been for little Fionn long hours of lonely sunshine, when the world seemed just sunshine on the sky. There would have been hours as long, when existence passed like a shade among shadows, in the paths narrow enough to be filled by his own small feet, or the goats, and he would have wondered where they went, and have marveled again to find that, wherever they went, they came at last, through loops and twists of the branchy wood, to his own door. He may have thought of his own door as the beginning and an end of the world, whence all things went and whither all things came. Perhaps he did not see the lark for a long time, but he would have heard him, far out of sight in the endless sky, thrilling and thrilling until the world seemed to have no other sound but that clear sweetness. And what a world it was to make that sound! Whistles and chirps, coos and cows and crocks would have grown familiar to him, and he could at last have told which brother of the great brotherhood was making the noise he heard at any moment. The wind too, he would have listened to its 1,000 voices as it moved in all seasons and in all moods. Perhaps a horse would stray into the thick screen about his home, and would look as solemnly on Fionn as Fionn did on it. Or coming suddenly on him, the horse might stare, all a-cock with eyes and ears and nose, one long drawn facial extension, ere he turned and bounded away with manes all over him, and hoofs all under him, and tails all round him. A solemn-nosed, stern-eyed cow would amble and stamp in his wood to find a flightless shadow, or a strayed sheep would poke its gentle muzzle through leaves. A boy, he might think, as he stared on a staring horse, a boy cannot wag his tail to keep the flies off. And that lack may have saddened him. He may have thought that a cow can snort and be dignified at the one moment, and that timidity is comely in a sheep. He would have scolded the jackdaw, and tried to out-whistle the throstle, and wondered why his pipe got tired when the blackbirds didn't. There would be flies to be watched, slender atoms in yellow gauze that flew, and filmy specks that flittered, and sturdy thick-ribbed brutes that pounced like cats, and bit like dogs, and flew like lightning. He may have mourned for the spider in bad luck who caught that fly. There would be much to see and remember and compare, and there would be always his two guardians. The flies change from second to second. One cannot tell if this bird is a visitor or an inhabitant, and a sheep is just sister to a sheep, but the women were as rooted as the house itself. End of chapter 1. Section 14 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn. Chapter 2. Were his nurses comely or harsh looking? Fionn would not know. This was the one who picked him up when he fell, and that was the one who patted the bruise. This one said, "Mind you, do not tumble in the well." And that one, "Mind the little knees among the nettles." But he did tumble, and echoed that the only notable thing about a well is that it is wet. And as for nettles, if they hit him, he hit back. He slashed into them with a stick and brought them low. There was nothing in wells or nettles, only women dreaded them. One patronized women and instructed them and comforted them, for they were afraid about one. They thought that one should not climb a tree. "Next week," they said at last, "you may climb this one." And next week lived at the end of the world. But the tree that was climbed was not worthwhile when it had been climbed twice. There was a bigger one nearby. There were trees that no one could climb, with vast shadow on one side and vaster sunshine on the other. It took a long time to walk round them, and you could not see their tops. It was pleasant to stand on a branch that swayed and swung. It was good to stare at an impenetrable roof of leaves and then climb into it. How wonderful the loneliness was up there! When he looked down, there was an undulating floor of leaves, green and green and greener, to a very blackness of greeniness. And when he looked up, there were leaves again, green and less green and not green at all, up to a very snow and blindness of greeniness, and above and below and around there was sway and motion, the whisper of leaf on leaf, and the eternal silence to which one listened and at which one tried to look. When he was 6 years of age, his mother, beautiful long-haired Murney, came to see him. She came secretly, for she feared the sons of Morna, and she had paced through lonely places in many countries before she reached the hut in the wood, and the cot where he lay with his fists shut and sleep gripped in them. He awakened to be sure. He would have one ear that would catch an unusual voice, one eye that would open, however sleepy the other one was. She took him in her arms and kissed him, and she sang a sleepy song until the small boy slept again. We may be sure that the eye that could stay open stayed open that night as long as it could, and that the one ear listened to the sleepy song until the song got too low to be heard, until it was too tender to be felt vibrating along those soft arms, until Fionn was asleep again, with a new picture in his little head and a new notion to ponder on, the mother of himself, his own mother. But when he awakened, she was gone. She was going back secretly in dread of the sons of Morna, slipping through gloomy woods, keeping away from habitations, getting by desolate and lonely ways to her lord in Kerry. Perhaps it was he that was afraid of the sons of Morna, and perhaps she loved him. End of chapter 2. Section 15 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn. Chapter 3. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The women Druids, his guardians, belonged to his father's people. Bob Mald was Uain's sister and consequently Fionn's aunt. Only such a blood tie could have bound them to the clan Pashkina, for it is not easy, having moved in the world of court and camp, to go hide with a baby in a wood, and to live as they must have lived in terror. What stories they would have told the child of the sons of Morna! Of Morna himself, the huge-shouldered, stern-eyed, violent, connected man, and of his sons, young Gulmore MacMorna in particular, as huge-shouldered as his father, as fierce in the onset, but merry-eyed when the other was grim, and bubbling with a laughter that made men forgive even his butcheries. And Conan Mael MacMorna, his brother, gruff as a badger, bearded like a bull, bold as a crow, and with a tongue that could manage an insult where another man would not find even a stammer. His boast was that when he saw an open door, he went into it, and when he saw a closed door, he went into it. When he saw a peaceful man, he insulted him, and when he met a man who was not peaceful, he insulted him. There was Gara Duv MacMorna and Savage Art Ugg, who cared as little for their own skins as they did for the next man's, and Gara must have been rough indeed to have earned in that clan the name of the rough MacMorna. There were others well-connected men, all as untamable, as unaccountable as their own wonderful countryside. Fionn would have heard much of them, and it is likely that he practiced on a nettle at taking the head of gold, and that he hunted a sheep from cover in the implacable manner he intended later on for Conan the Swearer. But it is of Uail Mac Bashkina he would have heard most. With what a dilation of spirit the ladies would have told tales of him, Fionn's father, how their voices would have become a chant as feet was added to feet, glory piled on glory, the most famous of men and the most beautiful, the hardest fighter, the easiest giver, the kingly champion, the chief of the Fiannan Ha'Irin. Tales of how he had been waylaid and got free, of how he had been generous and got free, of how he had been angry and went marching with the speed of an eagle and the direct onfall of a storm, while in front and at the sides, angled from the prow of his terrific advance, were fleeing multitudes who did not dare to wait and scarce had time to run, and of how at last, when the time came to quell him, nothing less than the whole might of Ireland was sufficient for that great downfall. We may be sure that on these adventures Fionn was with his father, going step for step with the long-striding hero and heartening him mightily. End of chapter 3. Section 16 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 4. He was given good training by the women in running and leaping and swimming. One of them would take a thorn switch in her hand, and Fionn would take a thorn switch in his hand, and each would try to strike the other running round a tree. You had to go fast to keep away from the switch behind, and a small boy feels a switch. Fionn would run his best to get away from that prickly stinger. But how he would run when it was his turn to deal the strokes. With reason too, for his nurses had suddenly grown implacable. They pursued him with a savagery which he could not distinguish from hatred, and they switched him well whenever they got the chance. Fionn learned to run. After a while he could buzz around the tree like a maddened fly, and oh, the joy when he felt himself drawing from the switch and gaining from behind on his bearer. How he strained and panted to catch on that pursuing person and pursue her and get his own switch into action. He learned to jump by chasing hares in a bumpy field. Up went the hare and up went Fionn, and away with the two of them, hopping and popping across the field. If the hare turned while Fionn was after her, it was sweet for Fionn, so that in a while it did not matter to Fionn which way the hare jumped, for he could jump that way too. Long ways, short ways, or bow ways. Fionn hopped where the hare hopped, and at last he was the owner of a hop that any hare would give an ear for. He was taught to swim, and it may be that his heart sank when he fronted the lesson. The water was cold, it was deep, one could see the bottom, leagues below, millions of miles below. A small boy might shiver as he stared into that wink and blink and twink of brown pebbles and murder, and these implacable women threw him in. Perhaps he would not go in at first. He may have smiled at them and coaxed and hung back. It was a leg and an arm gripped then, a swing for Fionn, and out and away with him, plop and fluff for him, down into a chill, deep death for him, and up with a splutter, with a sob, with a grasp, with everything that caught nothing, with a wild flurry, with a raging despair, with a bubble, and snort as he was hauled again down and down and down, and found as suddenly that he had been hauled out. Fionn learned to swim until he could pop into the water like an otter and slide through it like an eel. He used to try to chase a fish the way he chased hares in the bumpy field, but there are terrible spots in a fish. It may be that a fish cannot hop, but he gets there in a flash, and he isn't there in another. Up or down, sideways or endways, it is all one to a fish. He goes in and he is gone. He twists this way and disappears the other way. He is over you when he ought to be under you, and he is biting your toe when you thought you were biting his tail. You cannot catch a fish by swimming, but you can try, and Fionn tried. He got a grudging commendation from the terrible women when he was able to sleep noiselessly in the tide, swim underwater to where a wild duck was floating, and grip it by the leg. "Go on," said the dog, and he disappeared before he had time to get the ack out of him. So the time went, and Fionn grew long and straight and tough like a sapling, limper as a willow, and with a flirt and spring of a young bird. One of the ladies may have said, "He is shaping very well, my dear," and the other replied, as in a morose privilege of an aunt, "He will never be as good as his father." But their hearts must have overflowed in the night, in the silence, in the darkness, when they thought of the living swiftness they had fashioned and that dear fair head. End of chapter 4. Section 17 of Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. The Boyhood of Fionn, chapter 5. Irish Fairy Tales by James Stephens. One day his guardians were agitated. They held confabulations at which Fionn was not permitted to assist. A man who passed by in the morning had spoken to them. They fed the man, and during his feeding Fionn had been shooed from the door as if he were a chicken. When the stranger took his road, the women went with him a short distance. As they passed, the man lifted a hand and bent a knee to Fionn. "My soul to you, young master," he said, and as he said it, Fionn knew that he could have the man's soul, or his boots, or his feet, or anything that belonged to him. When the women returned, they were mysterious and whispery. They chased Fionn into the house, and when they got him in, they chased him out again. They chased each other around the house for another whisper. They calculated things by the shape of clouds, by lengths of shadows, by the flight of birds, by two flies racing on a flat stone, by throwing bones over their left shoulders, and by every kind of trick and game and chance that you could put a mind to. They told Fionn he must sleep in a tree that night, and they put him under bonds not to sing or whistle or cough or sneeze until the morning. Fionn did sneeze. He never sneezed so much in his life. He sat up in his tree and nearly sneezed himself out of it. Flies got up his nose, two at a time, one up each nose, and his hat nearly fell off the way he sneezed. "You're doing that on purpose," said a savage whisper from the foot of the tree. But Fionn was not doing it on purpose. He tucked himself into a fork the way he had been taught, and he passed the crawliest, tickliest night he had ever known. After a while he did not want to sneeze, he wanted to scream, and in particular he wanted to come down from the tree. But he did not scream, nor did he leave the tree. His word was passed, and he stayed in his tree as silent as a mouse and watchful until he fell out of it. In the morning a band of traveling poets were passing, and the women handed Fionn over to them. This time they could not prevent him overhearing. "The sons of Murna," they said, and Fionn's heart might have swelled with rage, but that it was already swollen with adventure. And also the expected was happening. Behind every hour of their day and every moment of their lives lay the sons of Murna. Fionn had run after them as deer. He jumped after them as hares. He dived after them as fish. They lived in the house with him. They sat at the table and ate his meat. One dreamt of them, and they were expected in the morning as the sun is. They knew only too well that the son of Whale was living, and they knew that their own sons would know no ease while that son lived. For they believed in those days that like breeds like, and that the son of Whale would be Whale with additions. His guardians knew that their hiding place must at last be discovered, and that when it was found, the sons of Mona would come. They had no doubt of that, and every action of their lives was based on their certainty. For no secret can remain secret. Some broken soldier tramping home to his people will find it out. A herd seeking his strayed cattle or a band of traveling musicians will get the wind of it. How many people will move through even the remotest wood in the year? The crows will tell a secret if no one else does. And under a bush, behind a clump of bracken, what eyes may there not be? But if your secret is legged like a young goat, if it is tongued like a wolf, one can hide a baby, but you cannot hide a boy. He will rove unless you tie him to a post, and he will whistle them. The sons of Mona came, but there were only 2 grim women living in a lonely hut to greet them. We may be sure they were well greeted. One can imagine Gold's merry stare, taking in all that could be seen. Cornon's grim eye raking the women's faces, while his tongue raked them again. There of MacMorna, shouldering here and there in the house and about it, with maybe a hatchet in his hand, and Arthur cursing further afield and vowing that if the cup was there he would find them. End of chapter 5.